I think we'll start now. I was waiting for the magic 40. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Emmeline Edwards. I'm the chair of World Women in Neuroscience. And this is a webinar that's part of our series that we have on a monthly basis. And today we are delighted to welcome Dr. Megan Peters. Megan is a cognitive and computational neuroscientist. She works at the interface of psychology, artificial intelligence, neuroscience, and philosophy. Megan just moved to the University of College London, where she leads the Reflection Lab. And this is an interdisciplinary group that studies how intelligent systems monitor and model their own knowledge, uncertainty, and experience. Previously, Dr. Peters was a 10-year professor in cognitive science and philosophy of science at University of California, Irvine. Before that, she was a bioengineering professor at University of California, Riverdale. She's a fellow of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research in Brain, Mind, and Consciousness, and she's president and co-founder of Neuromatch, an educational and field-building nonprofit serving 40,000 people in over 130 countries. We're extremely pleased and lucky to have Dr. Megan Peters present this webinar for us. It's titled, If Your AI Were Conscious, How Would You Know? Megan, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for that super kind introduction. And it is truly my pleasure and honor to be here and to speak with you all about this kind of crazy topic. So, the theme of these webinars, as I understand it, is computational neuroscience in the age of AI. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about as AI gets more powerful and it does become more embedded into doing computational neuroscience and leading to advanced understanding of the brain and the mind, it also may be developing a mind of its own. And so the question is, at what point should we really worry about that? How would we know if we've reached that point? So this project is really more on the philosophy of science or meta-science or science of science side than it is on the computational neuroscience side. But it draws heavily on themes that we see throughout computational neuroscience, cognitive psychology, cognitive sciences, and more. So I think you'll see a lot of the same themes that we use in, and the same tools that we use in understanding the brain and the mind applied to this science of science question. So I hope that this is interesting. And please, I'm hoping to also have a nice discussion. So write down all your questions so that we can have a nice chat later. Okay, so if your AI were conscious, how would you know? And this seems like kind of a crazy question that you might have with your friends sitting around at, in the evening. Maybe you've had a glass of wine and you're thinking, oh, if Claude were conscious, how would we possibly know? It kind of seems like someone is in there, right? And it's not now in 2026. It is no longer just a conversation that we all have in our living rooms with our friends after a glass of wine or something. It is a conversation that is actually very public, on the public stage, and that a lot of very smart, very accomplished, and very seemingly reasonable people are engaging with, including me, if you think that I'm seemingly reasonable. So, there's these conversations that are had between people like Dave Chalmers and Neil deGrasse Tyson. There's all these conversations that we see, these cases where AI startups are nonprofits are starting up and they're having welfare divisions in addition to the AI research itself. And this is not welfare of humans using AI. This is the welfare of the AI to make sure that the AI is having a good time. And this is also something that other people who work in other fields, but who have kind of come around to this consciousness field in their later part of their careers, that they're truly engaging with, and they're engaging with in a way that might surprise some of us. So this is just from, a month ago, basically, a little over a month ago, where Richard Dawkins is basically saying, yeah, I think that Claude is conscious. And it's on the basis of a conversation that I had with Claude, or several conversations that I had with Claude. And so this means that there are already, a great many people ascribing not just consciousness, but consequently moral status to these systems. And there are policies being developed and resources being spent on the welfare of potentially conscious artificial systems. And as artificial intelligence is embedded into everything that we do, for every computational neuroscientist in the room right now, I'm sure you're using Claude to help you do stuff. And I think that it's great. It's a powerful tool as long as you don't completely offload all your thinking to it. So the question is, at what point do we think that Claude has become more than a tool, more than a research partner, and it's become a research partner, another kind of conscious entity? So for the rest of this talk, I hope you'll keep this context in mind, that this is no longer just kind of science fiction. We need to end up developing policies that avoid putting the rights and welfare of supposedly sentient artificial systems above those of human beings and non-human animals, unless it is really convincingly the case that we need to be careful to do so. But on the other side, we want to also avoid, moral harms, and that we don't want to enslave potentially sentient systems. So all of that is to say, we need to get our tests for AI consciousness right. We really just can't get by on implicit or uncritical vibes. We can't just have a conversation with Claude and say, ooh, it feels like somebody's in there. And I think that this need is very clear when you look at other potential ways that supposedly sentient conscious AI could manifest, and it might not require language at all. So you might end up with these very cute, very sentient feeling systems that get hurt by each other, get hurt by us, and they don't have consciousness. So they might have different kinds of bodies. They might have different kinds of not bodies at all. This is a book about a sentient computer that or becomes sentient, and it's like a series of vacuum tubes on the moon, or it's a disembodied system. And so I'm going to put a bunch of other examples up here that show the ways that science fiction has explored the idea of sentient artificial systems and the complex interplay between our ascription of sentience to those artificial systems and our ascription of moral status, that we want to care about the welfare of these systems. Here they are sentient. We don't ascribe them the moral status that maybe they are due. Here we have questions about whether they can actually have the capacity to love, never mind being sentient. And here we have cases where we ascribe sentience, but they maybe don't need moral status, that we probably don't want to worry about whether Skynet is having a good time. And we probably also don't want to care about whether HAL 9000 is having a good time. But we still feel bad when we start dismantling HAL, and when HAL, starts to kind of degrade one bit at a time. And if I'm spoiling any of these science fiction examples for you, then you need to watch and read more science fiction, because these are the classics. Okay, so this is science fiction, except that it's kind of not now. And so here is another more clear example, maybe, that is a little bit nerdier and that maybe some of you haven't seen. And this is an example from Star Trek: The Next Generation, where in this very famous episode entitled The Measure of a Man, the rights of android officer Lieutenant Commander Data are threatened. Basically, the question is not just should we worry about whether Data is having a good time, but do we have the right to dismantle Data in order to study how he works, because he is the only sentient form of life of his artificial kind in the known universe at this point in Star Trek canon. And so the question is, if it is a sentient life form, not only should we worry about its suffering, but are we allowed to dismantle it to even figure out how it works? And so now this becomes a question about computational neuroscience, because a lot of computational neuroscience tools are being used to actually go in and change or dismantle or mess around with these artificial systems. We go in and we ablate components of these artificial systems to see what happens. Should we be allowed to do that? And so in this episode, Captain Jean-Luc Picard fights for Data's rights of self-determination, and it gets very metaphysical, and it becomes very much a Star Trekian kind of approach, where it's not really about the technology or space travel. It's really about how we as human beings grapple with these difficult kinds of scenarios. And so it ends kind of with Picard asking anyone in the court to show a means of measuring consciousness in any system, biological or artificial. So this brings us to the question for today's talk. If your AI were conscious, how would you know? And so the question is, do we just set a bunch of criteria based on language? We say if they can solve problems, if they have embodiment, if they exhibit symptoms or signs of self-awareness, They exhibit cases where they engage in self-preservation behavior. Maybe none of these or all of these are what you would say are important. But this is a big debate, and it's a big debate that nobody has the answer to yet. And so despite headlines like this from a couple years ago, here's how researchers will know if AI becomes conscious. If you actually go and read these papers, you will see that the answer is no, they won't know. We don't know yet. So one influential approach, though, has been through this indicators approach, which is to say, let's build kind of a checklist of the kinds of things that we would like to see in a supposedly sentient system, artificial or biological, but here it's focused on AI. And then we're going to go about seeing how current artificial systems stack up against that checklist. And so this is a paper that I contributed to, led by Patrick Butlin and Rob Long back in 2023, where our goal was to define these factors, these markers or indicators that will increase our credence that an AI possesses consciousness. Note that this is very clearly about our subjective credence. This is our degree of belief that that AI system has consciousness. It would be impossible for us to kind of evaluate the ground truth of the matter. Does it actually have consciousness? So this is always an inference process. But we assumed this computational functionalism approach, which basically says that there are computations that are of the right kind to support the construction of phenomenal conscious experience, and that's all you need. You don't need a particular substrate in order to actually evince that conscious awareness. So we said, okay, let's look at current scientific theories of consciousness. As we all know, there's a bunch of different theories of consciousness. That these are some of the ones that you can kind of fit into a computational functionalist perspective. And we went through a bunch of these theories and said, here are the indicators or the tick boxes that each of these theories would contribute to this checklist. And then we're going to see how current AI systems stack up. And the conclusion was in 2023 that there does seem to be some set of artificial systems that do tick some of these boxes, but there is not yet a system that ticks all of the boxes. And then, of course, that begs the question of, if you did have a system that ticks all of the boxes, are these even the right boxes, and what does that mean? So if you think this approach is valid or useful, and you actually want to learn how to implement some of these supposedly, consciousness-related indicators from a computational functionalist perspective, I'll do a quick plug here to show that, NeuroMatch, which Dr. Edwards very kindly mentioned in the introduction, has a module that is designed to teach you about some of these theories and how to actually build them into some Python scripts. And this is the last day of our Neuro AI course, where we're teaching folks about all sorts of other really useful stuff. So if you're not signed up for this course this summer, you can either do it next summer, or you can just go and look at all the materials yourself. It's all free and open source on our website. So if you want to just go muck about with some code and see what this might look like, please go help yourself. Okay. Yeah, NeuroMesh does a bunch of other stuff too, but I'll skip that for the sake of time. Actually, no, I'll just point out there are other courses you all are interested. There's Neuro AI, computational neuroscience, deep learning. We've got a new computational behavior course that's coming up in the near future. We've got a bunch of other kind of field building initiatives too. And so if you want to talk about any of this stuff, please feel free to send me an email about that in addition to the science that I'm presenting today. Okay, moving on from the shameless advertising. If your AI were conscious, how would you know? So you could build a checklist, like I've just shown you. And then the question is, what do we do with that checklist? Having ticked many or a lot of the boxes on that checklist, what happens next? And so an alternative approach then to just building checklists and counting up how many boxes you've ticked would be something like this. So this is called the iterative natural kind strategy. It was first proposed by Tim Bain and Nick Shea back in 2020 in a very philosophical piece. And then in 2024, Tim Bain and a bunch of us kind of pushed on more of a roadmap paper for what this might look like. So the strategy here looks like this. Don't just build a bunch of tests and count out how many kind of tests you pass, but you need to understand the compilation of those tests and how they end up working with each other to indicate the presence of an underlying natural kind of consciousness. So the idea is that you have a bunch of tests. These are examples of some tests for consciousness that might work on biological systems, excuse me. And the idea is that, if I hold a very smelly thing under your nose and it smells very good, you're going to have a different kind of sniff response than if it smells very bad. So a rose versus rotten fish is going to elicit a very different kind of sniffing response. And this is used in the clinic to tell whether someone is in a vegetative state or whether they are in a minimally conscious state, for example. There are other examples here, like the perturbational complexity index or the local global test. And so there's a number of these kind of tests for state consciousness that have been developed. And the idea is that you don't just want to apply these blindly to an artificial system. You want to understand how they co-vary with each other in a consensus population. So you do a bunch of these tests in humans. You look at whether they agree or disagree with each other. And then once you've decided these are the tests that are good, these are the ones that are stable and reliable and valid and co-vary with each other in expected ways, then you can apply them to the next most proximal population along, say, this proximity hierarchy. So I say, okay, octopuses, they don't have language, but they are made of biological stuff. And so I'm going to be able to apply some of these tests to them. But maybe they're farther away than other biological entities where these tests have been validated. So I'm going to first, before I can go to octopuses, I'm going to apply these tests to children, or I'm going to apply them to newborn infants, or those kinds of things. So those are closer to us than the octopuses. And so the idea is you apply these tests in this next most proximal population, you look at how they come out, you look at how they co-vary with each other, and then you update your beliefs not only about whether those populations are conscious, but also about whether these are good tests to begin with and what you think that they are telling you about this underlying kind of latent construct or natural kind of consciousness, the thing that we are supposedly discovering. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. And importantly, we want to make sure that these are validated tests. They are not tests for intelligence. They are not tests for capacity to be threatening. So these are constructs that we want to keep very simple and very distinct in our mind, that you can have a very intelligent system that is neither conscious nor threatening. You could have a very threatening system that is neither conscious nor intelligent. And this is the famous kind of paperclip example from Nick Bostrom that says, we've built this, very capable, very threatening artificial system that's very stupid. And we set it to build, very efficiently build a bunch of paperclips. And of course, it goes about like destroying the world in service of building paperclips very efficiently. And then, of course, on the other side, you could have something that's obviously conscious, or at least to me, very obviously conscious, but is not threatening and is not particularly intelligent. And this is, of course, a picture of my cat, who is not threatening unless you are a housefly, and it is arguable how intelligent he is. So all of these are very distinct concepts, and we want to make sure that the tests are for consciousness and not for these other things that typically co-vary with consciousness in biological entities, or could co-vary with consciousness. Okay, so, and this is me arguing on the internet with people who don't think these are different. Okay, so you could build a checklist, and then you could apply these validated tests, and you could kind of do this iterative natural kind strategy. But some of you, as I was describing this iterative natural kind strategy, may have noted a tension where I said, let's apply them to octopuses, but we can't do that. Yet we need to first apply it to something more proximal to us, like children or babies. So there's a real tension here, because now we have to decide how proximity works. Is an octopus closer to us than an artificial system? Is a baby closer to us than an octopus? And so depending on how you define this proximity dimension, these proximity measures, you might get very different outcomes. So large language models have language, octopuses don't. But octopuses are made of biological stuff, and large language models are not. And octopuses are embodied, and large language models are not. And so it depends very much. And so the idea that we wrote this in this paper in 2024, we wrote these actual sentences that measuring proximity in one way would place human neonates closer to the consensus cases than adult octopuses. But another might reverse that order, placing adult octopuses closer to us than our newborn conspecifics because they can locomote and they can solve problems and they can be sneaky and they can do all of these things that babies cannot do. So the issue is much more than just validating our test. For the iterative natural kind strategy to work, we have to decide when and how we're allowed to apply these tests to the next population. And so this has led to the present line of work that we are really just engaging with now. We're just starting this project in my group to try to understand how we can decide which populations are closest to these consensus cases, and then which tests are valid to apply to that population and what we should conclude from this entire enterprise. So we've started by proposing a number of proximity measures to help us select the next most proximal population. And so we can say there may be some alignment dimensions for proximity. You could say there's overlap in the kinds of computations that are used between two populations or two sets of systems. This is kind of the approach that we used in the papers that I showed previously, led by Patrick and Rob. So the idea is that if there's recurrent processing present, and there's higher order representations present, and there's, these a global workspace is present, that is an overlap in the kinds of computations and kinds of algorithms employed by the system between humans and artificial systems. But I think that's not a test for consciousness. I think that's just a proximity measure that tells us how far that system is from us. We can also take inspiration from the idea of canonical computations to identify the type of computations that we might want to put into a proximity measure like this. So the idea of canonical computations, as some of you may know, they've been talked about a lot in the field of like attention and divisive normalization. So this idea that the way that a cell responds to a stimulus in terms of its firing rate is a function not only of the response properties of that neuron, but also by the activity in the surrounding network. So that if the rest of the network around that neuron is very active, then that neuron is going to be kind of selectively suppressed. It's going to be divisively normalized or inhibited. So we could kind of do a survey of a bunch of different computations and look for maybe divisive normalization is a little bit more substrate independent than maybe some other things. I don't know, this is a cartoon. But the point here is that this would be a way that we could say there could be a measure of how proximal a system is to us along this computational alignment. Do they possess the same kinds of computations? The question then is, do we care about whether these are consciousness related or consciousness unrelated? But this is a future problem to solve. I'm basically just laying out a roadmap here so that all of you can go and solve all these problems, not just me. So another way that we could do some of these proximity measures would be representational alignment. Many of you are probably familiar with the idea of representational similarity analysis. You say, does this artificial neural network or does this dolphin have the same kind of internal representations as that honeybee or this human being? And so there's these ways of measuring neural representations or trajectories through neural representation space. So we could use that maybe as a proximity dimension. Representational structure could be one of them, but also the kinds of representations possessed by an entity could be a component of this. And then we could also, we're working on some of this stuff with an ongoing adversarial collaboration that I am part of, where we're looking at the kinds of representations that may be present to support the differentiation between perception and imagination. So I just want to put that up there. And then you could also just have straight up behavioral alignment, very obvious, right? Across a large battery of tasks, does this system behave the same way that a human being does? Here's a perceptual task, here's a language task, here's a motor task, here's a whole bunch of other tasks. Do we have the same kind of behavioral output profile across these different systems? And this could include not just behavior like navigation or discrimination capacity, but it could also include behaviors like introspective or metacognitive capacity. So the relationship between an observer's ability to do something in response to a stimulus out there in the world versus its ability to kind of reflect upon its own experiences. And there's some interesting ongoing work in the apparent metacognitive or introspective behavior of large language models that might feed into this. So these are some candidates. This is certainly not all of them. There are several others. We could do domain adaptation. This is the idea that you can take two different distributions from two different sources across a wide range of contents. And you can use statistical approaches in machine learning to align them to each other so that the distributions are no longer different. A very concrete example of this is to say I have a bunch of X-ray images from hospital 1 and a bunch of X-ray images from hospital 2, and I want to train a machine learning algorithm to decide whether those X-ray images of lungs have COVID or not in them. But I know that the machines are different between hospital 1 and hospital 2, and I don't want the machine learning algorithm to learn to differentiate hospital 1 from hospital 2. I want it to learn to differentiate COVID in these lungs from not COVID in these lungs. And so I want to kind of twist and morph the distributions of all of the X-ray images from both hospitals onto each other so that that differentiator goes away and the actual thing that I care about might be revealed. So we could ask, how easy is it to twist and morph these distributions of responsivity and brain patterns between artificial systems and us, or monkeys and us? And so this could be a metric. You could also use dynamic proximity, where like throughout development or throughout like the natural aging process, or throughout learning, these are the kind of types of representations and types of capacities that tend to emerge, and they emerge in this order with this dynamic structure. So the point of all of this is that there's ways of measuring proximity that may have nothing to do with the actual test for consciousness. And I think that that's important. Another one would be implementational similarity. Do you have biological neurons or not? Or maybe I don't care about the neurons, but I care about whether you have a substrate that can implement analog signaling and not just digital signaling. So if these are test agnostic measures of thinking or processing like we do, then we think they might matter for applying consciousness tests. I shouldn't apply a language-based consciousness test to an octopus and expect it to work out and tell me anything useful, because octopuses don't have language. And same way, I should not apply a biology-based consciousness test, like the perturbational complexity index, to a large language model, because it just doesn't have the right substrate in order to make that test informative. So instead of building a checklist and applying validated tests, I think what we need to do is select and then apply these validated tests or checklists and interpret the results, all based on these proximity measures and the way that they interface with the tests themselves. Okay. So the other thing that I'm going to mention, though, is that I kind of snuck in here this idea of interpreting the results. And so now let's imagine that we have built this machine. We've got all of the right proximity measures. We know exactly the ways in which octopuses are closer to us, but babies are even closer, and large language models are over there. And we have that whole space mapped out. And we have our set of validated consciousness tests. And we know how they're going to, we think we know how they're going to maybe come out in these artificial systems, but we know they're valid in us, at least. So we apply all these tests, and then what? What have we learned on the basis of all of their output? So this now is some ongoing work. This paper is actually in revision right now at Philosophy of the Mind Sciences. So this is a great time for you to give me feedback so that I can incorporate it into the revision if I've got like the bandwidth to do so. And so the idea here is, again, how do we do this bit? I have my validated tests. I picked my next most proximal population. I applied my test. I measured their output. And somehow now I am supposed to interpret the outcome of those tests with respect to the probability that this new population is conscious, and update my understanding about whether those were good tests to begin with and what they are even measuring, right? What the consciousness thing, the consciousness natural kind is. So how do we do this bit? So we've been developing in my group, and by my group, I really mean me, nights and weekends, kind of working on this. And so this is very much like Megan's side passion project for at least a little bit here, but we're actually, now we have a grant to start working on it, which is very cool. And the idea is this, that we need to combine latent variable modeling with Bayesian belief updating. And we need latent variable modeling because this is the step that allows us to say, what even are we measuring anyway? Presumably, the tests for consciousness are not each independently measuring some completely different thing, that there is some underlying latent structure, some set of factors that we would call the natural kind of consciousness, the thing that is actually consciousness. So if we have a bunch of tests and we apply latent variable modeling approaches, not just structural equation modeling, which is very deterministic, but I think we need some probabilistic and like non-parametric approaches here. We can maybe discover what that latent structure is, and then we can ask questions about whether that latent structure stays stable when we move from one population to the next. But we need to move beyond existent latent variable modeling approaches because they kind of assume the presence of a single stable latent structure. And here we are asking, is that even a reasonable assumption? And so I think we need new latent variable modeling approaches or tweaks to latent variable modeling approaches to be able to answer this part of the question. And then we want to do this belief updating. We want to say, I want to update beliefs about that latent structure and about the observables that I have measured, which are the tests, the test outcomes. I want to update my beliefs about that latent structure, the tests being good tests, being reliable tests, and so on, all kind of in this updating step that then will allow me to say, having applied these tests and measure the outcome, I think I know what's going on, that this new population is positioned at this spot in the latent space. And that means that they do or do not have consciousness. And also these tests were bad and I should throw them away when I move on to the next most proximal population. So this is the idea. We've started working out the formalism here, but it's very much in early stages, and I very much welcome your feedback on this. And I'm going kind of quickly here, giving you just a little bit of the flavor of what we're doing. If you want a little bit more of the detail, please go have a look at the preprint, which I'll put a QR code up for at the end here, which has a lot more kind of detail worked out. Okay, so if we're going to answer the question of which populations are conscious based on where they fall on the consciousness latent space or whether they share latent structure with the consensus cases, which is us, I think we need to apply this kind of iterative updating latent variable modeling approach. And the cool thing is that that's not just going to tell us which populations may have consciousness or our degree of belief that they do, but it also might help us understand what is this thing that we're calling consciousness anyway, and is it a stable natural kind? And this isn't to say that we're going to find that consciousness is like the ability to have language and the ability to do navigation and the ability to problem solve and all that stuff. The latent structure might not be something that we can easily put into words, but we might still discover what components it has and how they manifest in observables that might help us build a more comprehensive understanding. Okay. And so that's what this is saying, that, you know, we might kind of discover what even is consciousness anyway along the way. Very ambitious goal, but we'll see how far we get. And I think that this is a promising approach to try to get at that thing. And it follows a lot of history in the history of science anyway, when we have this kind of mongrel concept that we didn't know what it was, like life. What is life? You know, it's a collection of factors. Like, what is intelligence? It's a collection of factors. And there's some ugly history in some of these previous examples, but I think we can learn a lot and make some progress here with these approaches nevertheless. So to wrap up, I think, no, we don't yet have conscious AI. I don't believe that Claude is conscious. I don't believe that it has the right structures. I don't believe that it exhibits the right capacities. But this is an intuition. This is a vibes-based assessment for me. And so I think what we need to do to move beyond these vibes-based assessments is build a formal framework of the kind that I have just laid out. And this is because we might very soon have AI that fares much better on any tests that we build. So the question will be not only which tests are the right ones, or can we build the correct tests, but how in the heck do we interpret the outcome of those tests? What does that even tell us? So I think that developing a proximity-guided, iterative natural kind strategy built on latent factor analysis and Bayesian belief updating will help us get to this answer. It'll help us get to doing better consciousness science along the way. And maybe we are much farther from this coming soon Skynet warning than some people might argue. This is the preprint that I mentioned. So if you want to have a look at this, hold up your phone and go and look at it now. It will get heavily revised. I'm working on that now. But a lot of the core elements are there. And so I welcome feedback. My revision is due very soon. So if you want to give me feedback, please do so very quickly. And I think I will stop there. And then that leaves us a lot of time for discussion. So if you don't know who some of these people are, by the way, you need to watch more sci-fi and more Star Trek. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Megan, for a lovely and very provocative presentation.